And I'm still really quite hopeful about where we're going in the last couple of years as we bring our product forward, especially right now as we're bringing it into projects. We're having a lot of conversations with people that are aligned. And I just want to say this individual moment where you can really connect with one other person that really believes in the future of building, that really believes in a sustainable building. I think that's really where these decisions are being made. If I could just say that it doesn't happen on a system level. It really feels like there are champions
Mhm.
happening everywhere, and we just need to find each other,
Yeah.
and this industry will change.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Activating Curiosity. I am Ryan Ware. And today's conversation is one of those areas that we as humans can feel is almost too large to solve. So we tend to resist. We tend to pull back on the action steps that we think we can actually make an impact on. And the guest today has really looked at her career and spent her career into this big problem and breaking it down into an area that can really start to make a major impact. And that is on how we look at climate change and how we think about global warming in the materials that we're utilizing and how we're using them within the built environment. So today I have with me Allison Dring. She is the CEO and co-founder of Made of Air, and they are located in Berlin, Germany. Hey, Allison, how are you?
Hey, Ryan. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great.
Good, good. And welcome to Activating Curiosity. So before we get into the episode, why don't you tell a little bit more about yourself, your past, kind of where you got started and how you got to this point of being the CEO and co-founder of Made of Air.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I should start by saying I'm an architect by training. I studied in the University of Arizona. I did my graduate degree in London at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And I
Nice.
was, at the time, very committed to becoming an architect. And I was very focused on climate topics already. I'd sort of, I guess it was early days for that when I was finishing my degree, but
Right.
I did take it as a cause sort of right out of the gate.
Hmm.
Um, and I worked a couple of years in London in the architecture industry. And I think that really was sort of they say like you have to start with discomfort before you get curious about something. And I think those
Yeah.
years really showed me a lot about how the industry worked, which isn't something you learn in university.
Right.
Um, so I think I sort of started there looking at how buildings go together, um, and seeing how few stakeholders were involved in the decisions around how buildings go together. And then at
Yeah.
the same time, weighing sort of like what is the climate impact for those decisions. And, you can look at other industries where that's happening too. But I think in the built environment, the difference is the scale. You have this massive volume,
Hmm.
massive amount of materials going into the world, into use with very few stakeholders. And certainly the planet is never the stakeholder in that room. So I guess like peering into that space is where I started really thinking about what could be better here. How could we approach the building of buildings differently when we think about resources? So that
Hmm.
was really those are the seeds of my of where Made of Air started.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're describing this journey, right? We go through university to learn enough about architecture to step out and then get into the practice. And you're coming out of university at a time, I'm assuming it's similar to mine, where yes, USGBC and kind of the lead program, that started in what, the 90s and really kind of kicking off in 98, 2000. And I don't know how you felt, but like through my whole life, we have been having conversations from the United States side, and I can remember even as a kid, like the global warming issue was discussed, and it didn't matter by who. We were all talking about it in science and learning it in school and the impact that we could make. So you not only are you kind of coming out, you're getting into practice. This is something that obviously, yeah, like you said, you start to learn enough, you're getting uncomfortable, you're starting to ask questions about climate and what that impact could be. But was there these pivotal points where you said, hey, look, like this problem can't be resolved if we all, focus on A, B, or C or whatever it is, and something just was intriguing for you enough to say, I'm going to step aside in this role because I know it didn't go straight into made of air. Like, what were those signals? What were those things that were really pointing you towards the problem that you were aiming to solve? And maybe it was the big problem, global warming, climate change. But what were some of those smaller things that you were looking at? Like, these are things that I can really start to take on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was focused on the materials going into buildings right away. I guess that was one of my first jobs. I was tasked with looking at like the materials in a floor for
Hmm.
a retail space. And I really had the urge to reinvent that material, even though I knew none of the suppliers that I was talking to would listen. They had off the shelf products. The clients wanted off the shelf. But I was just never satisfied with that. And I was always trying to convince them, hey, could you use like cork in your product instead of
Yeah.
silicate or something? I was always trying to think through like how could we change up that supply industry? And there was no way. It was a brick wall. And I learned the hard way that wasn't going to happen in my role the way it was. And I guess when I think about how that scales across the built environment, I started to look around at how buildings, what were the main materials, not the high aspirational architect materials that you
Hmm.
think about a lot, but really, what are we talking about? What is the reality? And a lot of these materials are mineral and fossil, and they do come with very high emissions. We build with a lot of plastic, a lot of concrete, a lot of steel.
Hmm.
And, there are exceptions, but basically, those were and you see buildings going up with just that material mix. And without counting those emissions, they sort of sleep by, people don't realize the volumes we're talking about. And that leads to, data, which I'm sure you know, which is like 40% of global emissions are coming from the built environment,
Hmm.
and materials play a big part. So I guess like in terms of in my career, what happened to get me out of my little safe zone as an architect was was to first I started paying attention to global strategies for carbon removal. I got very excited about these they were called like the mega eco engineers. It was around
Hmm.
2008. I don't know if you followed this, but there were articles about, how can we suck CO2 out of the sky, and
Hmm.
and we had these great, you know, um, basically the beginning of DAC, direct air capture, was started around this time. And out of all of the strategies, which sounded very high tech, seeding the clouds, all this sort of stuff,
Hmm.
one was biochar, and it was included in here. And I always thought, wow, this is really low tech. And what biochar does is just using biomass waste streams. So letting the plant do all the work of absorbing the CO2 from the air, but just making sure that all that CO2 doesn't go back in the air when the plant dies. That's all biochar
Hmm.
is. It's just creating a kind of charcoal where you can trap all that CO2
Hmm.
into carbon. And I read about that and I just thought, out of all of these strategies, this is a material. And this one can be scaled. And I'm sitting in a market that has high volume and needs a better option. And I have a market right now that can drive the demand for this material in a significant way for the planet. And
Hmm.
that was one moment where I just really thought, this could be a really interesting connect. And
Hmm.
I should also mention my co-founder, who's our CTO, also comes from architecture and has always been more on the material science side. And he was really investigating how these carbon removal strategies could translate into tangible materials. So I think at the
Hmm.
time we had already started thinking about, could that be a reality? And being slightly entrepreneurial at the time, that's one thing led to another.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's that curiosity piece. You're talking about asking different questions about a material where an industry, one, you probably felt like, all right, who I'm telling them what I want, but I'm getting that pushback because I know how I would feel sometimes. It's like, how much can I change an entire manufacturing process? And especially if they're not interested, right? Or they're selling their product or whatever it is, or like you said, that supply chain. But the fact that you were able to you pulled back and said, I'm seeing all of these things. There a lot of it's potentially much larger investment that someone needs to do with some of these carbon removals, like you said, but noticing a true opportunity of letting the plants do what they do, but once they've reached sort of end of life, how to utilize that further, how to take advantage of that to start to introduce it into the built environment. So you kind of mentioned some of those things that were, when you were practicing or starting to get into asking those questions, you had resistance from those manufacturers. How have you seen as you've journeyed through this and studying biochar and bringing in your partner to go through the material science? And we can get into, the acceleration of that with AI and some of these other things. But like what is some of the resistance that you're continuing to see or potential obstacles that are coming up that you've heard, and how are you addressing those? How are you helping kind of answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, the industry is it's notoriously conservative, um,
Hmm.
and slow to change, and sometimes not in a bad way. It's a very it is the public world, our
Right.
buildings and our infrastructure. I think that one of the challenges that we recognized early on is that the in the construction industry you have a paradox. You have a massive demand for sustainable materials going into buildings. And just relating back to the, 40% emissions globally, there's a significant amount of that that's embodied carbon. So the
Hmm.
materials, the upfront carbon that are going into the building that we don't have time to reverse those emissions later.
Right.
They really they're there, and so we're seeing a massive demand. How can we cut the emissions for the materials that are going into these buildings? How can we respond to new policy? How can we respond to getting to building permits faster? So sustainability is becoming um, the reason to build now.
Hmm.
And at the same time, in the construction industry, you have massive complexity to implement any new material, let alone a biomaterial.
Yeah.
And that's, weighing those things constantly, like knowing that there are buyers, there's an industry, there's a massive pull for this. And I'm talking about like real estate being backed by banks that are operating with ESGs that
Hmm.
mandate better embodied carbon emissions. So we're not talking about just like people just wanting to do better for the planet. They're mandated to do it. And we're seeing
Right.
policy that's mandating it to do it. And, we're talking about sustainable buildings used to be where you could charge higher rents, but now we're seeing sustainable buildings are the only way your building's going to get rented. And I
Right.
think that is very true in a lot of the big cities, especially here in Europe. And that reality has translated to a massive market opportunity. And then at the same time, you have, the challenges are the certification landscape for one.
Hmm.
It's a very expensive process. It's not aligned with how innovation works. It's certainly not aligned with sort of cash lean startups that are trying to deliver innovation.
Right.
What it is aligned with is incumbent industries that are maybe a big manufacturer that wants to do a small sustainable product and has time to develop that for 4 years and bring it to market for a
Hmm.
small market share. It isn't it's more aligned with that process than it would be for a fast moving, high impact innovation strategy, like what we're trying to do. So you have to kind of always negotiate
Hmm.
uh, certifications and all of that complexity to be able to do it.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a demand for it, and you said something interesting that kind of caught my attention, which was the financing side to even go build a building anymore. And this is something I keep having conversations about, which is that you have policies, like we have mandates, regulations, and policies, but here in the States, those change every 4 years. How do you manufacture around that? So it's this area of how will, the capital markets, like insurance to financing and other things where it's just too expensive to build and replace, which is what we end up doing. I think about the fires in California to what happens in Florida. Like when we're looking and thinking about building or designing a building anymore, like the capital market's going to drive it. You might not even be able to get builder's risk insurance, anymore, or to build in certain areas where the costs come so extreme that we can't build, or developers won't because of the cost. And I think what you're getting to is now anymore, especially in Europe. That's what I was kind of curious of how you're seeing that across different markets. But mandates and regulations are forced compliance, which is one answer to it. I'm assuming you're also looking at this like, how do we get this to be intrinsic? You talked about like we're slow to change as an industry. We getting things done, and this is a material. We're talking about materials versus delivery models, which is a whole nother leap. But I'm assuming the larger opportunity is beyond mandates and regulation. It is this intrinsic piece within all of us to understand like we're driving the cost up to build currently
Yeah.
because we can't get financing. The rates keep increasing because of rebuilding and putting things back together the way we always have. So I'm curious, like, when you think about this, I don't think it's an or thing. I think it's an and, but like the bigger opportunity is the intrinsic piece of us as the industry side to be looking at this of we can drive real change when we think about material different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to start at the beginning of that value chain, and the beginnings of our built environment value chains are resources. And I
Hmm.
think that's, just making that difference from the very beginning has knock-on effects all the way through. Um,
Hmm.
when we talk about biochar, for example, um, it's biogenic carbon. It comes from biogenic sources. And what we mean by that is we have resources that are coming from above ground. And
Hmm.
historically, that hasn't been the case. We built our cities with subterraneous resources, fossil and mineral, and we continue to do that. We've
Right.
depleted our carbon pools to be able to build our cities. And you can kind of think about it's like an inversion, right? We've taken everything out of the ground and put it into buildings. And
Hmm.
what we want to do is now shift that thinking to above ground resources. So biogenic, biomaterial, anything we can grow. And in our case with biochar, we're taking it from the air. So we're talking about linking all these value chains in the built environment. Just by linking them to a new resource, we can cut our
Hmm.
emissions sometimes by half just by making that change. And I think some of the challenges that you see when you do that, because I mean, obviously, like timber is having a great moment. We're seeing a
Yeah.
lot of CLT building, timber structure, which is fantastic. We're thinking more about circularity, which is really great.
Hmm.
But I think, those all those value chains, they have this knock-on effect. You can really see biomaterials creating different buildings. But if you try to make buildings the way we make them right now with biomaterials, they're going to fail. They can't compete with hundreds of years of fossil and mineral economies. Like
Hmm.
we need new technologies that can take the opportunity of the biomaterials and get them to perform the way that buildings need them to perform. And I
Hmm.
think there's adjustments on both sides, but I think that is the real opportunity for our industry right now.
Yeah. I love how you kind of stated it. It's going, in simple form. It is going from below ground to above ground and how we start to think about a lot of the major materials in a building. And you're right, mass timber, that took policy change and it's still, has its own challenge of adoption. We all
For
desire it
sure.
because it looks great, and does certain things. But when you're talking about how can we, the biochar approach in the technology, because I want you to dive into that a little more because I think you are not only testing and creating some materials, uh, biochar from a filler standpoint, but you're also looking at the way I'm seeing it is almost like a platform through technology and other ways to help people create materials. This was something I think you alluded to, is like the cost, right? The cost of some of these things for somebody to go test it for themselves. But you're taking this technology and this approach beyond the facade material, which I want you to get into, and what that's doing, the facade material into other areas for the built environment.
Sure, yeah. I think the way that Metaverse started, our vision was really like we needed use cases for biochar. We thought about it in terms of tech first. We
Hmm.
have a great carbon removal strategy. It needs a market. It needs to be it needs demand to drive it into higher volumes. And we not only looked at the volume of the built environment as an opportunity, but the decades to almost centuries long um, storage opportunity for
Yeah.
carbon. So like there aren't many industries that can really hold on to a material as long as buildings do. So I think that was sort of, it felt like a safe place
Hmm.
for this technology to link with. And so yeah, we'd always thought about it that way. Like let's get the building to store carbon, and then let's look in the building where these opportunities are possible. So we were never really application specific. We thought
Yeah.
about it as, if we have this new resource, let's see if we could pack it into all kinds of different things. And I think we're now seeing an industry that's starting to deliver that. We're one company. We set out as a technology, and we did, I think, a great job thinking about how that technology can be deployed. But we can't deploy every application as one small company. So
Right.
I think there are a lot of great companies doing things with biochar and concrete. There's insulation. And we've seen some great packaging things that are outside the built environment, but still
Right.
uh, and so we had to kind of focus in on facades because we really believe that the building envelope can do a lot better. But
Hmm.
we don't plan to stop there. I think this is a material that can be tested into all kinds of applications. Its properties are closer to a mineral than they are to a biomaterial. And I think that is the nice, unique thing. We have biochar has a biogenic origin, but it behaves more like a mineral. So it has better properties. It's very dry. It's better in fire.
Hmm.
Has all kinds of great knock-on effects that we still have yet to unlock. So
Yeah.
yeah, super interested on where it goes in buildings.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned you're kind of getting started. You started thinking about it from that technology standpoint. And then it was, what can we show people and show the world of what we can produce utilizing this? And I know when I've been able to kind of see the facades, I know as a designer, it's like, this is attractive looking material, right? Like it's doing work, multiple areas of aesthetics and being able to store carbon, as well as being a material that has been developed sustainably. Um, and I think those are things that caught my attention because I even see like you had glasses on there. I think some of the other things that you
Right.
produce is like
Yeah,
like this thing can become so many other things, and it's just going to take our active minds, right? Getting into that curiosity of like what is possible, like you were saying when you were younger, asking a lot of those questions because I do think when an exterior and the facade is a great place to start. And I'm thinking like, well, interior, right? Like
yeah,
we still build with drywall in a lot of areas. And it's like, okay, what are other options? And I know, substrates may have to happen in some of these cases, but I do think when you start to think about the opportunity with, say, mass timber and then starting to think about materials the way you're investigating them. I do think there's a huge opportunity. You're right. Our buildings aren't designed to necessarily be up for 10 years. Some interiors kind of are made that way, but the structure and a lot of the components that we're putting in, like they're 50-year buildings. And there's so
yeah,
much opportunity there to to have that building, do far more for the climate than the damage that was done by building it potentially.
exactly. Yeah.
You got into thinking about the biochar. as a filler and a material and looking at the opportunity for sustainability, and that was something that kind of you knew that you wanted to put your energy and focus into. But if the
Right.
industry is slow to change or slow to adopt certain things, right? Because it is so enormous and so many decisions are made and all the different stakeholders, like we've done better at sustainability, but as you're evaluating it from the way you're looking at materials as a startup and the technology side and doing more with the materials we're doing, like what does make it so important for the industry to look at it through that lens beyond the way they are looking at it today?
I think, I mean, the global carbon budget is one way that you could look at it. There was a paper that I came across in 2015 that was written by our advisor, Dr. Galina Turkina, in Nature magazine, and it referenced, she studies models of cities and how we store carbon, and
Mhm.
why we shouldn't be storing carbon in cities. So exactly aligned with kind of how we were thinking, and I think what we saw in articles like these were that there's predictions that if we were to keep going with the traditional building materials we've been using for the last 100 years, um, we as soon as we have to build for the expanding population that we're going to see over the next 20, 30 years, we'll
Mhm.
deplete our carbon budget just by not making any changes. So if you align that with the way the industry thinks, which is kind of risk averse and slow to change,
Mhm.
and you know that this sort of population increase is coming, we're going to need housing and infrastructure, and the materials for that are um, are a good chunk of where the emissions are going to sit. So
Yeah.
I guess that was a wake up call for me that the industry is going to need some different way to look at it. And I guess,
Mhm.
like, LEED and BREEAM, and I think they're the USGBC, like, I think those organizations have gotten so much more powerful, and I'm really impressed with the architecture industry. Architects have really changed their role in the building cycle to almost
Mhm.
be kind of gatekeepers for the climate. And I think that has made all the change there, the specifiers and the whole process. And I think that's been a really great sign. But I think where we haven't seen a lot of the changes sort of deeper in the supply chains. You don't have, you don't have all those stakeholders believing in sustainability. Not all of them are incentivized to do anything
Mhm.
different. In fact, they're not trained to make change happen. They're trained to be experts in the piece that they're doing in the value chain. So,
Yeah.
like, I don't see a lot of incentive digging deep in there. So far, there's just been a lot of forcing mechanisms, like real
Mhm.
estate saying, come on, guys, we need a better green material for this building. And, uh, and then, and then pushing at the same time not to pay a green premium. So it does put pressure on companies like ours to come in and say, we're going to make a product happen with great economies of scale, very cost efficient. We're going to meet the market where it's at, and we're going to do it with biogenic materials that are carbon negative. It's a tall
Mhm.
order, but we know that that's what it takes in order to enter this industry. So we're trying to meet it where it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's so true that, yeah, we might have different parts of a project that want to go in a direction. And like you said, if the supply chain can't adjust or won't adjust to provide the material for to answer that problem as you're stating, which is, hey, we're gonna have a huge issue when we deplete our ability dealing with carbon. And I think we said a few decades, right? Based off
Hmm.
just the human growth. Um, and this is where it's one of those things. It's almost like selling the invisible. Like, I've said this before too, is like the cost of being wrong about like that nothing would happen, right? If you're taking the side like, hey, nothing's going to happen, like that cost of that being, incorrect is far greater than the cost of taking the steps and the approach to address it, right?
Yeah.
To address it now. And you mentioned something that developers, again, back to like developers and property managers, like they want it. It's almost like a lot of innovations that's happening, within our industry is like, I just don't want to pay for it. Well,
Yeah.
the payment's happening at some point. Like it's happening somewhere because again, and maybe this is how we think about financing projects and the way everything kind of works is like there's an increase to do good, right? And then we go through a process, and I this is my least favorite term in the industry. Well, we'll value engineer. And it's like the word value should not exist
Yeah.
in that because that was the whole point was value engineering, and you probably agree with this too, is like it was to put a better solution in for a longer life cycle. It wasn't lower cost. It was going to do something greater for whatever it was you were engineering at the time. You didn't,
Yeah.
go to the lowest denominator and pull that out and put it into a project. So like you're discussing, it's like, hey, here is the real issue. The bank's going to be depleted. Like we will not have any real strong opportunity in the future to deal with this based on the way we're building today. And I like that you said it. I do think once lead kind of came in between lead in the states, right, and then everywhere else kind of globally and how we were thinking about designing a project, it was this guideline. It was a way to make us question things as we were going through a project, to start to shift it. And I know even at that time, there were manufacturers like they did start getting into it and saying like, "Hey, this is going to be an opportunity for us," which is more of a capitalist society. But some really went intrinsic of like, "This is the right thing. Like this is the
Mhm.
right thing to do for us." And I'm sure 25 years later, the costs have recovered from that initial kind of shift into how they were doing materials, how they were thinking about it. We You and I are probably both lived through this, like asbestos, right? Like there was a lot of materials we were utilizing that we thought were good, and they were more harmful for us. So like the industry has gone through these mindset shifts of how we should be thinking about building, um, because we do play a role as architects or engineers and contractors as well as property developers to take on the responsibility to work with the supply chain and the manufacturers to, and just my view, solve this issue. Because I the next question really comes into, in a we can all think about this in our from our own frame of mind, but you know, what's the cost of not doing this, which you already started alluding to, that there are other costs for
Mm.
not solving, some of these issues that you're talking about solving, right? How do you usually approach the market without scaring everybody about the potential risk?
I think, I mean, you said it really well. The cost of not doing it, the cost of climate disaster, the sort of the long term thinking around what you're building, and your building is an asset, and
Hmm.
how are you protecting that asset is often on the table in the beginning of the project. And I think if you think about it like that, the materials make sense in terms of asset thinking.
Hmm.
If your building is not going to be conforming in the next 10 years, then you're going to think about it differently. And what I do love about the real estate industry and the architecture industry is that it survives political moments. I
Hmm.
think I don't want to get into the
Yeah.
politics right now, but I think there's a political moment happening right now in sustainability, and I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of patience in the built environment to ride these things out. I think there's been a real commitment around sustainability, 10 years ago or 20 years ago with the evolution of these institutions like LEED, et
Hmm.
cetera. And I do think it's laid the right groundwork where the thinking has changed and there is this asset protection idea in place, and it won't kind of ride the ups and downs of the political moment. So that's been kind of nice to see.
Hmm.
But when I like, just to get back to your question, like what's the cost of the of not doing it? Um, That conversation in my experience doesn't happen that often. I think there's a lot of risk assessment that goes into buildings. If you're in a climate disaster zone, it may look differently. I don't. We're not building right now in California in
Right.
those sort of more extreme areas. So I think that's probably having a different conversation than what we're looking at. But I think it is a little more indirect um, how the long-term asset that the building stays in conform with, for example, EU policy here in Europe. We know it's quite strict, and the need to report on embodied carbon is coming. So that those conversations are a little more indirect, I'd say, that we're
Hmm.
having. But I imagine that there's a much more urgent conversation going on in those more kind of climate risk areas, and I can
Hmm.
see that the idea of a green premium um, isn't a premium anymore. It is, you are paying into a system that it's an insurance system
Right.
at some point, and you do that already with the materials you choose.
Yeah. Well, I like how you said it, right? We're having a policy moment, and we do. They change, but we have throughout my career, like we've been through a number of policy changes that have kind of come into place, and um, not to get political about it because that's not what the show really is focused on, but it is how how can we understand that to be true while still understanding that we can still be making an impact even as policies are shifting as individuals, because that's the biggest thing is like some of us may work in manufacturing, some are in architecture, some engineering, wherever we are. And this conversation, I think we've already alluded to it, it can feel enormous, like it's what can I do? And I think that's, if we're not in the industry, I think that's what a lot of people feel. They just are like, I don't even know where to begin. I don't even know how to start to think about this. And then they just the easy thing is to just keep doing what they've been doing because, well, I can't really make an impact or it won't impact me in the future. But when I take a step back and think about what you just said again with the insurance and the cost and getting to everybody loves it has to cost less or be neutral. Well, there are future costs that we don't always evaluate in the moment. And I do have this feeling that this insurance side to financing are going to be where we feel it. Like we can't build enough housing and we
Yeah.
can't get enough infrastructure built. And then there's damage done to it because of major climate um, catastrophes that do come along wherever you are on the planet. And those, okay, so now what? Now there's additional, you got to go deal with that situation plus rebuild.
Hmm.
And insurance companies are already saying, like you said, no, you can't rebuild here because you can't get insurance. Florida, California, a lot of these areas, like they won't insure you,
Yeah.
or insurance companies have pulled out to where it's almost like the pressure starts to come into of like, well, if the building isn't designed in this way, and both from the insurance market and even the capital side, we're not going to fund it and we're not going to give you insurance, but you would get a better rate and a discount on insurance because you're protecting against the long term or
Yeah.
that because that's how insurance comes, right? They have to have enough to cover to replenish. Well, our insurance rates are going to continue to rise to cover future expenses because the cost is only going to increase dramatically just to
Yes.
rebuild anything. So again, back to there is a cost to this. We just, because we don't feel it in today's wallet, we feel like we shouldn't be doing anything to deal with it.
Yeah.
And I think whether you're in architecture, which are, the listeners that we focus on, most of us come through that, but it's a way, I don't know, I think about it as a way to have a conversation with somebody who isn't in the industry and just doesn't know what to do next.
Hmm.
Of like, well, how much has your insurance gone up? How
Yeah.
much can you get it? So I know that was a long winded response to yours, but it's just something I've been thinking about of like, how will capital markets really start to drive more than the political side mandates that are coming in place or changing every so many years?
Yeah.
But I don't know what your thoughts are on that, if you have additional thoughts on it, but
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think there's the cost of doing nothing. I mean, there's been a lot of studies around this. We our material also works as a filler for
Mhm,
plastic composites, and we worked a little bit with the car industry and on providing composite materials that would go into the car. And I think we started to look at how how they would deal with the value of the carbon.
mhm,
Because when you're building a car, like the economics are very clear. The car is a real product. I tend to think of buildings the same way, but I know that's
right.
not how the industry sees it. But the car is the product. And if you can reduce the emissions from the cars as driving off the lot, like that's a good target for a lot of car companies.
Mhm,
And what we talked about was in setting the carbon value against what they were going to have to purchase in offsets in the market. And that triggered a conversation around what is the cost of doing nothing? How much is
yeah,
it going to cost you now to buy an offset in the market that you know is stable? And what's it going to cost you in 15 years to buy the same offset, the same ton of CO2 now versus in 10 years? And in 10
mhm,
years, it's probably like, 10x 20x in price. So if they purchase it now, they can lessen the dependency on purchasing it later. So that conversation around cars
mhm,
always kind of struck me like that's how maybe we should be thinking about buildings because we have buildings that are going to stand
right,
um, for decades, and we need to start thinking about, like you said, like the climate situations that those buildings are going to sit in 10 years, and what does that cost look like
mhm,
compared to what you're paying today. And I don't think the industry, we do tend to be a little short term thinking in this industry,
yeah,
even though we're building for a long term situation.
yep,
There's a lot about what is my building going to do when its doors open, and
yeah,
there is asset protection thinking, but when we come to material orders, we want to see everything that's been around for 100 years, and we rely on those
mhm,
established channels. That's our idea of a risk assessment. We've always done it this way, not what's going to happen to my building in 10 years if I continue to do it this way.
yeah, we do, we go to default and kind of that easy mode that we've known because it's just how we are as humans, like,
Yeah.
it one, the industry is it always feels like they're rushed, right? Designers are always rushed to get it done because they gotta get the shovel on the ground to be building, and asking any more questions can sometimes feel like, "Well, who am I to ask this question?" But
Yeah.
if we do, you said it, and I think was so great, is like stretching our lens out enough to think about what we are designing and participating in, is that we will have ownership. Like, we're still gonna be practicing and building in 10 years, 15 years, like, the costs are only gonna continue to increase. So the answer can't just be, um, only get it through the design and get it built as fast as I can so I can get on to the next project. It's what kind of career and legacy do I wanna have in 10 to 15 years? Like, will we even be able to afford to build anything? Will
Yeah.
I even have a career? And some people will say, I can't, there are things you can't control, but like in this moment, thinking like today's situation is this. Tomorrow's climate is going to be totally different. And even where I'm sitting today, today's climate is so different than what it was 20 years ago, in a lot of places. So we don't we don't do situational checks and balances when we're designing, in my opinion. It's like, just because it was the answer in 1970 does not mean it's the answer in 2026 or whatever year you might find yourself in. Like, what has shifted? What has changed? Like, ask a lot more questions to say, like, am I in that default mode of just grabbing it because you mentioned kind of that risk adverse piece. That's because in the moment, that's what you're working on. You are working on the project, but the bigger opportunity for future development and future design and learning and developing comes from looking forward. Comes from you can't predict the future, but you sure can protect it a little more by asking different questions. That's just Ryan. That's me.
Yeah, I
How I
like that.
think about
Yeah,
designing. But
that makes sense.
um, so then, Allison, there's all of these things that could go wrong, right? With what we're dealing with the climate, if this thing isn't, if we don't all step forward and kind of take a moment to be a part of it, there's a cost to it. But you've probably projected out like what does success look like for you, not just personally, but for Made Air, but for the industry to kind of take a part in addressing these issues that you're aiming to solve. Like, what does that success look like?
The success. Yes. Uh, well, we have a pretty ambitious mission at Made of Air. So, our mission is to reverse climate change. So I think that's, let's start broad.
Yeah.
We have a technology that we think is linked to a big enough opportunity to bring that kind of impact.
Hmm.
Um, we're a startup working on a cladding product right now that utilizes that technology, and the technology is much broader than the product that we're bringing to market in the moment. So
Hmm.
I think this is a technology that can impact change. It can change the way you think about building materials in general. When you imagine right now what buildings are made of, and maybe not a lot of people have spent time thinking about that. Not as much time as I have, obviously.
Right.
But I think, that standard toolkit of materials. I think success looks like inventing another material category that sits
Hmm.
right alongside concrete and wood and steel and all the other kind of things that make up our buildings. That new material category being um, a biochar composite, a permanent form of carbon that can be utilized in your roofing material, that can be put
Hmm.
into your insulation, that can be the window frame, that can be the floor, the wall paneling in the new coffee shop. It can be ceilings, it can be furniture. um, the more carbon we can store in the building, the better the building can be active in reversing the climate
Hmm.
crisis. And I want to see buildings become active in that. I think I've always thought, our ability to build is kind of it's such a cool act that we can do,
Hmm.
that we do as a human race. And if we can have it not cause harm is one goal. But for me, it's like, can we have it do good in the world?
Hmm.
And I think that this technology has really opened my eyes to that opportunity. And what does it mean for me? I mean, at Native Air, we are really looking for success. For us is bringing our product out there into the market and seeing it used ubiquitously. Um, we're
Hmm.
building something that has a lot of scalability. We have a product that um, that in its core has sustainability. It's built with sustainability in mind.
Hmm.
And it doesn't have any particular kind of design direction, or it can go in many directions. So we like to think of it as the DNA for a lot of new cladding. We want to
Hmm.
see the building envelope do better. So I think that's seeing it just be deployed globally is something that we're personally very excited about.
Hmm. I love how you said it. Uh, you want to see the buildings become active in this fight that we're all facing around climate change and kind of global warming and all of the things that you've been spending your career on. I agree. It's like if it's just sitting there, right? Like, yes, we're occupants of it. Yes, we're doing, whatever's needed inside of it. But how do you engage something that doesn't have feelings, it doesn't have emotions, it just becomes an active player in helping address an issue? I think that's phenomenal mission and kind of vision and the purpose of what you're doing there at Made of Air, but personally as well, you and your partner and your team. Um, and I love that you're looking at it from a standpoint of like, yes, we could produce products. Those are things that you can do and continue to enhance and that you can expand. And I agree, seeing what you're doing with the facade, like there's huge potential for the interior, space that provides a far, more environmental friendly material than I think the way we currently build. But, you know, you're just getting started. And with all of these technologies, like the way material science is expanding, and utilizing, I'm sure, AI and even being able to test, and we didn't get into this, but like additive manufacturing, like how far can some of these things go as you're looking at it to get things to scale easier. So I love it. I love the idea that I got fascinated by it. This getting the building skin and the facade to become that active participant um in in the problem that you were aiming to solve. I think that's something that all of us as designers and contractors and architects, like, I think we all want to do the right thing. And I think we talked about it. Like they just how can we find as individuals that time to do the research, right? And to yes, there's codes, yes, there's classifications, yes, there's all of that testing that has to be done to get a material kind of be approved. You're in an area, you're in Europe where there's a lot more restrictions and mandates and things put into place. But I'm sure as you're continuing to expand, we'll start seeing more and more across America and other things, right, Allison? Like you guys are
Yeah,
looking to do work everywhere.
absolutely. We're really interested in the US and Canada. We're having great conversations with industry partners there.
Hmm.
And I think yeah, Europe is a very regulated space. So, in some ways, very good because we're passing all the certifications and we feel
Yeah,
like that will translate well into other economies.
yeah,
But there's always a regional change. The vernaculars are different in different
hmm,
countries. And so we're trying to have a product that can adapt to that. So the US it's a really interesting market for us also because there's an abundant amount of biochar going on in the US.
yeah,
Has a lot of wood waste, a lot of biomass waste, and a lot of great producers scaling it
hmm,
up in the US. So we're very interested in that market too.
yeah. Well, that's exciting. I know you're just kind of really getting started, and I just think there's huge opportunity here for anyone listening who has thought those things that Allison did when you were younger. Like, there's got to be something bigger, and that's part of it to get listeners to want to explore and kind of reach out and like, I've been thinking about this material, or I've talked to this person, or even somebody in manufacturing that's just like, hey, there's got to be a different way that we're thinking about how we're producing this material to get it to play more of an active role. So then, Allison, if somebody is listening, what are some things that you would recommend that the curiosity is now kind of risen and they're saying, "Hey, I'd like to learn more," or even whether it's things that you're doing or just some books or articles that you're like, "Hey, they should pick this up and take a look at that to begin to take some next steps."
Yeah, I mean, I've met a lot of great people recently that are thinking about how to store carbon in buildings, um, and I think there's a lot going on in that space
Hmm.
that I could recommend. I think there's been a lot of discussion around circularity. I haven't heard as much around carbon negative, and I
Hmm.
would really like encourage people to look into what is carbon negative, what do we mean by that, and there are a lot of companies that are claiming to be carbon negative, and maybe only storing carbon for a short time. I think there's a distinction there, so I would encourage people to look into that. That biochar, for example, is permanent carbon storage. It stays in place for 1,000
Hmm.
years. It doesn't release CO2. So these permanent strategies create a carbon negative products, and when you have those, you have actual drawdown of CO2, and you use them as building materials. So there's a whole field of research in that I find fascinating, but, I kinda geek out on that. But, But yeah, I'm happy to think through and suggest
Hmm.
links to you later that that would make sense for that.
Yeah, we'll put some links in that you find interesting, and put them into the show notes so that listeners just wanna dive in. Like you said, I think that's part of it is you don't have to be Allison to that level, right? Like, as an individual, we just need to be taking that first step, picking up an article, trying to understand, like you said, what is carbon negative? There's a lot out there versus kind of the biochar and storing it for thousands of years and the advantage that can have. But again, it comes back towards each of us as individuals being willing to see a problem and kind of say, "Hey, I want to step into it and try to figure out how to resolve it." And I don't think it sounded like you had that moment where you're like, "Who am I to step into this arena?" You said you were curious and you just kind of dove into it. So I'm appreciative that you did, in that you've taken that background in architecture and the things that you've been you were passionate about when you were younger, first before you got into university, and then as soon as you got out and kind of start practicing to say like, hey, someone's got to start looking at this. Someone's got to get involved in the supply chain. Somebody's got to look at these things different, and finding relationships, like you said, with your partner that that can really take on, a big challenge and break it down into something that I think is achievable. Whether it's facades or getting some materials. So I appreciate all that you're doing at Made of Air, Allison, you and your team. I'm so glad that you were willing to be on Activating Curiosity.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I loved the questions. I love this topic, and yeah, no, I love looking back. To be honest
Yeah.
with you, like the architecture industry, it's been a long career already, and you like you were saying, we've seen a lot of changes happening, and
Hmm.
I'm still really quite hopeful about where we're going. In the last couple of years, as we bring our product forward, especially right now as we're bringing it into projects, we're having a lot of conversations with people that are aligned, and I just want to say this individual moment where you can really connect with one other person that really believes in the future of building, um, that really believes in a sustainable building. I think that's really where these decisions are being made. If I could just say that it doesn't happen on a system level. It really feels like there are champions
Hmm.
happening everywhere, and we just need to find each other,
Yeah.
and this industry will change.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. You don't need a system and you don't need a process. You don't need SOP. You just need other humans that are curious to start talking about it. So thanks
Exactly.
so much, Allison, for coming on and having the conversation. I love it. I think we could talk forever, and maybe at some point as you continue on your journey, we'll find a way to regroup and talk more. So thanks for being on.
Thank you.
Thanks. So that was our episode with Allison Dring, the CEO and co-founder of Made of Air out of Berlin, Germany. And I know that, climate change and sustainability and a lot of the terms we're used to in our industry that we've been talking about for a long time, whether we're in the US or other markets, we've had a lot of associations and organizations begin to help us put things into perspective so that we can design and plan and build around those, as well as manufacturers can begin to think about how they're producing their materials. So it's not obviously a new topic, and we talked about that we've been, my whole life, this some of these things have been part of the discussion. But Allison, her story of coming from architecture and realizing that she may have felt like she was pushing a string. Like, I'm talking to manufacturers who aren't on the same agenda as me in my career. And she took a step back and looked at a moment to pivot and begin diving into those things and those areas that were really intrinsic of what really drove her, where she was passionate and where she really felt like she could live her whole purpose in creating Made of Air as a business by taking biochar and thinking about biomass and thinking about storing carbon, utilizing above ground versus below ground materials in order to produce construction materials, as well as, beginning to partner and develop a technology and a process that allows other people to develop materials for anything that they want to produce. So there's a lot of opportunity for listeners to go out there and kind of research. We will put her recommendations in the show notes, and as well as some of the social media links. But something that came up after we were recording, we started talking about sort of that long view, how you think about we design for today. And within economics, there are formulas that you could talk about and look into called true cost. Like, it may cost something today, but what is that true cost? What is the long-term cost? So it isn't just about the project life cycle that we need to think through. That's where we need to slow down, ask different questions, and understand our role in how we can engage in thinking about building materials besides just, grabbing the last spec. And we can all feel overwhelmed. We can all feel like, who am I to step into this? Like, how can I make any sort of impact? Well, Allison did that. And I believe that anyone who has that drive and passion is able to step out of the fog and begin to ask questions, that you too can find a way to make major impacts as it relates to whatever problem it is that you're aiming to solve. So I hope you stay well. I hope you continue to dive into those things, continue to explore things that excite you and things that you believe that you would really want to take a part in solving. So until next time, I hope you continue to activate your curiosity as well as curiosity within others. The Activating Curiosity podcast is brought to you by Connected Consulting Group and Connected Coaching, part of the Curiosity Building Experiences. If you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss a conversation. Share the podcast with your network and help us bring more curiosity into the construction industry. Interested in becoming a guest or a sponsor? Visit us at activatingcuriosity.com for more details. Until next time, keep leading with curiosity.